Welcome to Supreme Court Opinions. In this episode, you'll hear the court's opinion in Garland v. Cargill. In this case, the court considered this issue. Is a bump stock device a machine gun as defined in 26 U.S.C. Section 5845B? The case was decided on June 14, 2024. The Gale Force Light Supreme Court held that ATF exceeded its statutory authority by issuing a rule that classifies a bump stock as a machine gun under 26 U.S.C. Section 5845B. Justice Clarence Thomas authored the 6-3 majority opinion of the court. First, a semi-automatic rifle with a bump stock does not fire more than one shot by a single function of the trigger. The phrase function of the trigger refers to the physical movement of the trigger that activates the firing mechanism. With or without a bump stock, a semi-automatic rifle requires the trigger to be released and reset between each shot. The bump stock merely accelerates the rate of fire by causing these distinct trigger functions to occur in rapid succession, but it does not change the fundamental operation of the firearm. Each shot still requires a separate trigger function. Second, even if a bump stock-equipped rifle could fire multiple shots by a single trigger function, it would not do so automatically as required by the statute. Firing multiple shots with a bump stock requires ongoing manual input from the shooter, who must maintain the right amount of forward pressure on the rifle's front grip. This additional manual input goes beyond the single function of the trigger specified in the statute. In contrast, with a traditional machine gun, simply holding down the trigger causes continuous fire without additional manipulation. Because a bump stock requires this extra physical input, it does not meet the automatically requirement of the statutory definition. Justice Samuel Alito authored a concurring opinion suggesting that Congress can amend Section 5845B if it wants to treat semi-automatic rifles equipped with bump stocks as the same as machine guns. Justice Sonia Sotomayor authored a dissenting opinion, in which Justices Elena Kagan and Cotton G. Brown Jackson joined, arguing that the majority adopts a narrow understanding of machine gun that is inconsistent with the ordinary meaning of the statutory text and unsupported by context or purpose. The opinion is presented here in its entirety, but with citations omitted. If you appreciate this episode, please subscribe. Thank you. Justice Thomas delivered the opinion of the court. Congress has long restricted access to machine guns, a category of firearms defined by the ability to shoot automatically more than one shot by a single function of the trigger. Semi-automatic firearms, which require shooters to re-engage the trigger for every shot, are not machine guns. This case asks whether a bump stock, an accessory for a semi-automatic rifle that allows the shooter to rapidly re-engage the trigger, and therefore achieve a high rate of fire, converts the rifle into a machine gun. We hold that it does not and therefore affirm. Under the National Firearms Act of 1934, a machine gun is any weapon which shoots, is designed to shoot, or can be readily restored to shoot, automatically more than one shot, without manual reloading, by a single function of the trigger. The statutory definition also includes any part designed and intended for use in converting a weapon into a machine gun. With a machine gun, a shooter can fire multiple times, or even continuously, by engaging the trigger only once. This capability distinguishes a machine gun from a semi-automatic firearm. With a semi-automatic firearm, the shooter can fire only one time by engaging the trigger. The shooter must release and re-engage the trigger to fire another shot. Machine guns can ordinarily achieve higher rates of fire than semi-automatic firearms because the shooter does not need to release and re-engage the trigger between shots. Shooters have devised techniques for firing semi-automatic firearms at rates approaching those of some machine guns. One technique is called bump firing. A shooter who bump fires a rifle uses the firearm's recoil to help rapidly manipulate the trigger. The shooter allows the recoil from one shot to push the whole firearm backward. As the rifle slides back and away from the shooter's stationary trigger finger, the trigger is released and reset for the next shot. Simultaneously, the shooter uses his non-trigger hand to maintain forward pressure on the rifle's front grip. The forward pressure counteracts the recoil and causes the firearm, and thus the trigger, to move forward and bump into the shooter's trigger finger. This bump re-engages the trigger and causes another shot to fire, and so on. Bump firing is a balancing act. The shooter must maintain enough forward pressure to ensure that he will bump the trigger with sufficient force to engage it. But if the shooter applies too much forward pressure, the rifle will not slide back far enough to allow the trigger to reset. The right balance produces a reciprocating motion that permits the shooter to repeatedly engage and release the trigger in rapid succession. Although bump firing does not require any additional equipment, there are accessories designed to make the technique easier. A bump stock is one such accessory. It replaces a semi-automatic rifle stock, the back part of the rifle that rests against the shooter's shoulder, with a plastic casing that allows every other part of the rifle to slide back and forth. This casing helps manage the back and forth motion required for bump firing. A bump stock also has a ledge to keep the shooter's trigger finger stationary. A bump stock does not alter the basic mechanics of bump firing. As with any semi-automatic firearm, the trigger still must be released and re-engaged to fire each additional shot. The question in this case is whether a bump stock transforms a semi-automatic rifle into a machine gun, as defined by Section 5845B. For many years, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, ATF, took the position that semi-automatic rifles equipped with bump stocks were not machine guns under the statute. On more than 10 separate occasions over several administrations, ATF consistently concluded that rifles equipped with bump stocks cannot automatically fire more than one shot by a single function of the trigger. In April 2017, for example, ATF explained that a rifle equipped with a bump stock does not operate automatically because forward pressure must be applied with the support hand to the forward handguard, and, because the shooter slides the rifle forward in the stock to fire each shot, each succeeding shot fires with a single trigger function. ATF abruptly reversed course in response to a mass shooting in Las Vegas, Nevada. In October 2017, a gunman fired on a crowd attending an outdoor music festival in Las Vegas, killing 58 people and wounding over 500 more. The gunman equipped his weapons with bump stocks, which allowed him to fire hundreds of rounds in a matter of minutes. This tragedy created tremendous political pressure to outlaw bump stocks nationwide. Within days, members of Congress proposed bills to ban bump stocks and other devices designed to accelerate the rate of fire of a semi-automatic rifle. None of these bills became law. Similar proposals in the intervening years have also stalled. While the first wave of bills was pending, ATF began considering whether to reinterpret Section 5845B's definition of machine gun to include bump stocks. It proposed a rule that would amend its regulations to clarify that bump stocks are machine guns. ATF's about-face drew criticism from some observers, including those who agreed that bump stocks should be banned. Senator Dianne Feinstein, for example, warned that ATF lacks statutory authority to prohibit bump stocks, explaining that the proposed regulation hinged on a dubious analysis and that the gun lobby and manufacturers would have a field day with ATF's reasoning in court. She asserted that legislation is the only way to ban bump stocks. ATF issued its final rule in 2018. The agency's earlier regulations simply restated Section 5845B's statutory definition. The final rule amended those regulations by adding the following language. The term automatically as it modifies shoots, is designed to shoot, or can be readily restored to shoot, means functioning as the result of a self-acting, or self-regulating mechanism that allows the firing of multiple rounds through a single function of the trigger, and single function of the trigger means a single pull of the trigger and analogous motions. The term machine gun includes a bump stock type device, i.e., a device that allows a semi-automatic firearm to shoot more than one shot with a single pull of the trigger by harnessing the recoil energy of the semi-automatic firearm to which it is affixed so that the trigger resets and continues firing without additional physical manipulation of the trigger by the shooter. The final rule also repudiated ATF's previous guidance that bump stocks did not qualify as machine guns under Section 5845B, and it ordered owners of bump stocks to destroy them or surrender them to ATF within 90 days. Bump stock owners who failed to comply would be subject to criminal prosecution. Michael Cargill surrendered 2 bump stocks to ATF under protest. He then filed suit to challenge the final rule, asserting a claim under the Administrative Procedure Act. As relevant, Cargill alleged that ATF lacks statutory authority to promulgate the final rule because bump stocks are not machine guns as defined in Section 5845B. After a bench trial, the district court entered judgment for ATF. The court concluded that a bump stock fits the statutory definition of a machine gun. The Court of Appeals initially affirmed, but later reversed after rehearing en banc. A majority agreed, at a minimum, that Section 5845B is ambiguous as to whether a semi-automatic rifle equipped with a bump stock fits the statutory definition of a machine gun, and the majority concluded that the rule of lenity required resolving that ambiguity in Cargill's favor. An 8-judge plurality determined that the statutory definition of machine gun unambiguously excludes such weapons. A semi-automatic rifle equipped with a bump stock, the plurality reasoned, fires only one shot each time the trigger acts, and so does not fire more than one shot by a single function of the trigger. The plurality also concluded that a bump stock does not enable a semi-automatic rifle to fire more than one shot automatically because the shooter must maintain manual forward pressure on the barrel. We granted certiorari to address a split among the courts of appeals regarding whether bump stocks meet Section 5845B's definition of machine gun. We now affirm. Section 5845B defines a machine gun as any weapon capable of firing automatically more than one shot, by a single function of the trigger. We hold that a semi-automatic rifle equipped with a bump stock is not a machine gun because it cannot fire more than one shot by a single function of the trigger, and, even if it could, it would not do so automatically. ATF therefore exceeded its statutory authority by issuing a rule that classifies bump stocks as machine guns. A semi-automatic rifle equipped with a bump stock does not fire more than one shot by a single function of the trigger. With or without a bump stock, a shooter must release and reset the trigger between every shot, and any subsequent shot fired after the trigger has been released and reset is the result of a separate and distinct function of the trigger. All that a bump stock does is accelerate the rate of fire by causing these distinct functions of the trigger to occur in rapid succession. As always, we start with the statutory text, which refers to a single function of the trigger. The function of an object is the mode of action by which it fulfills its purpose, and a trigger is an apparatus, such as a movable catch or lever, that sets some force or mechanism in action. The phrase function of the trigger thus refers to the mode of action by which the trigger activates the firing mechanism. For most firearms, including the ones at issue here, the trigger is a curved metal lever. On weapons with these standard trigger mechanisms, the phrase function of the trigger means the physical trigger movement required to shoot the firearm. No one disputes that a semi-automatic rifle without a bump stock is not a machine gun because it fires only one shot per function of the trigger. That is, engaging the trigger a single time will cause the firing mechanism to discharge only one shot. To understand why, it is helpful to consider the mechanics of the firing cycle for a semi-automatic rifle. Because the statutory definition is keyed to a function of the trigger, only the trigger assembly is relevant for our purposes. Although trigger assemblies for semi-automatic rifles vary, the basic mechanics are generally the same. The following series of illustrations depicts how the trigger assembly on an AR-15 style semi-automatic rifle works. In each illustration, the front of the rifle, i.e., the barrel, would be pointing to the left. We begin with an overview of the relevant components. Figure 1. The trigger is a simple lever that moves backward and forward. The square point at the top left edge of the trigger locks into a notch at the bottom of the hammer. The hammer is a spring-loaded part that swings forward toward the barrel and strikes the firing pin, causing a shot to fire. The disconnector is the component responsible for resetting the hammer to its original position after a shot is fired. We turn next to how these components operate. Figure 2. When the shooter engages the trigger by moving it backward, as indicated by the arrow, the square point of the trigger pivots downward and out of the notch securing the hammer. This movement releases the spring-loaded hammer, allowing it to swing forward. Figure 3. At the top of the hammer's rotation, it strikes the firing pin, causing the weapon to fire a single shot. Figure 4. The firearm then ejects the spent cartridge from the chamber and loads a new one in its place. The mechanism that performs this task swings the hammer backward at the same time. Figure 5. As the hammer swings backward, it latches onto the disconnector. This latching, circled above, prevents the hammer from swinging forward again after a new cartridge is loaded into the chamber. The disconnector will hold the hammer in that position for as long as the shooter holds the trigger back, thus preventing the firearm from firing another shot. Figure 6. Finally, when the shooter takes pressure off the trigger and allows it to move forward, as indicated by the arrow, the hammer slips off the disconnector just as the square point of the trigger rises into the notch on the hammer, circled above. The trigger mechanism is thereby reset to the original position shown in Figure 1. A semi-automatic rifle must complete this cycle for each shot fired. ATF does not dispute that this complete process is what constitutes a single function of the trigger. A shooter may fire the weapon again after the trigger is reset, but only by engaging the trigger a second time and thereby initiating a new firing cycle. For each shot, the shooter must engage the trigger and then release the trigger to allow it to reset. Any additional shot fired after one cycle is the result of a separate and distinct function of the trigger. Nothing changes when a semi-automatic rifle is equipped with a bump stock. The firing cycle remains the same. Between every shot, the shooter must release pressure from the trigger and allow it to reset before re-engaging the trigger for another shot. A bump stock merely reduces the amount of time that elapses between separate functions of the trigger. The bump stock makes it easier for the shooter to move the firearm back toward his shoulder and thereby release pressure from the trigger and reset it. And it helps the shooter press the trigger against his finger very quickly thereafter. A bump stock does not convert a semi-automatic rifle into a machine gun any more than a shooter with a lightning-fast trigger finger does. Even with a bump stock, a semi-automatic rifle will fire only one shot for every function of the trigger. So, a bump stock cannot qualify as a machine gun under Section 5845B's definition. Although ATF agrees on a semi-automatic rifle's mechanics, it nevertheless insists that a bump stock allows a semi-automatic rifle to fire multiple shots by a single function of the trigger. ATF starts by interpreting the phrase single function of the trigger to mean a single pull of the trigger and analogous motions. A shooter using a bump stock, it asserts, must pull the trigger only one time to initiate a bump firing sequence of multiple shots. This initial trigger pull sets off a sequence, fire, recoil, bump, fire, that allows the weapon to continue firing without additional physical manipulation of the trigger by the shooter. According to ATF, all the shooter must do is keep his trigger finger stationary on the bump stock's ledge and maintain constant forward pressure on the front grip to continue firing. This argument rests on the mistaken premise that there is a difference between a shooter flexing his finger to pull the trigger and a shooter pushing the firearm forward to bump the trigger against his stationary finger. ATF and the dissent seek to call the shooter's initial trigger pull a function of the trigger while ignoring the subsequent bumps of the shooter's finger against the trigger before every additional shot. But the definition does not define a machine gun based on what type of human input engages the trigger, whether it be a pull, bump, or something else. Nor does it define a machine gun based on whether the shooter has assistance engaging the trigger. The statutory definition instead hinges on how many shots discharge when the shooter engages the trigger. And, as we have explained, a semi-automatic rifle will fire only one shot each time the shooter engages the trigger, with or without a bump stock. In any event, ATF's argument cannot succeed on its own terms. The final rule defines function of the trigger to include not only a single pull of the trigger but also any analogous motions. ATF concedes that one such analogous motion that qualifies as a single function of the trigger is sliding the rifle forward to bump the trigger. But, if that is true, then every bump is a separate function of the trigger, and semi-automatic rifles equipped with bump stocks are therefore not machine guns. ATF resists the natural implication of its reasoning, insisting that the bumping motion is a function of the trigger only when it initiates, but not when it continues, a firing sequence. But, Congress did not write a statutory definition of machine gun keyed to when a firing sequence begins and ends. The definition asks only whether a weapon fires more than one shot by a single function of the trigger. Finally, the position that ATF and the dissent endorse is logically inconsistent. They reason that a semi-automatic rifle equipped with a bump stock fires more than one shot by a single function of the trigger because a shooter need only pull the trigger and maintain forward pressure to activate continuous fire. If that is correct, however, then the same should be true for a semi-automatic rifle without a bump stock. After all, as the dissent and ATF themselves acknowledge, a shooter manually bump firing a semi-automatic rifle can achieve continuous fire by holding his trigger finger stationary and maintaining forward pressure with his non-trigger hand. Yet, they agree that a semi-automatic rifle without a bump stock fires only one shot each time the shooter pulls the trigger. Their argument is thus at odds with itself. We conclude that a semi-automatic rifle equipped with a bump stock is not a machine gun because it does not fire more than one shot by a single function of the trigger. A bump stock is not a machine gun for another reason. Even if a semi-automatic rifle with a bump stock could fire more than one shot by a single function of the trigger, it would not do so automatically. The definition asks whether a weapon shoots, automatically more than one shot, by a single function of the trigger. The statute thus specifies the precise action that must automatically cause a weapon to fire more than one shot a single function of the trigger. If something more than a single function of the trigger is required to fire multiple shots, the weapon does not satisfy the statutory definition. Firing multiple shots using a semi-automatic rifle with a bump stock requires more than a single function of the trigger. A shooter must also actively maintain just the right amount of forward pressure on the rifle's front grip with his non-trigger hand. Too much forward pressure and the rifle will not slide back far enough to release and reset the trigger, preventing the rifle from firing another shot. Too little pressure in the trigger will not bump the shooter's trigger finger with sufficient force to fire another shot. Without this ongoing manual input, a semi-automatic rifle with a bump stock will not fire multiple shots. Thus, firing multiple shots requires engaging the trigger one time, and then some. ATF and the dissent counter that machine guns also require continuous manual input from a shooter. He must both engage the trigger and keep it pressed down to continue shooting. In their view, there is no meaningful difference between holding down the trigger of a traditional machine gun and maintaining forward pressure on the front grip of a semi-automatic rifle with a bump stock. This argument ignores that Congress defined a machine gun by what happens automatically by a single function of the trigger. Simply pressing and holding the trigger down on a fully automatic rifle is not manual input in addition to a trigger's function. It is what causes the trigger to function in the first place. By contrast, pushing forward on the front grip of a semi-automatic rifle equipped with a bump stock is not part of functioning the trigger. After all, pushing on the front grip will not cause the weapon to fire unless the shooter also engages the trigger with his other hand. Thus, while a fully automatic rifle fires multiple rounds automatically, by a single function of the trigger, a semi-automatic rifle equipped with a bump stock can achieve the same result only by a single function of the trigger and then some. Moreover, a semi-automatic rifle with a bump stock is indistinguishable from another weapon that ATF concedes cannot fire multiple shots automatically, the Ithaca Model 37 shotgun. The Model 37 allows the user to slam fire, that is, fire multiple shots by holding down the trigger while operating the shotgun's pump action. Each pump ejects the spent cartridge and loads a new one into the chamber. If the shooter is holding down the trigger, the new cartridge will fire as soon as it is loaded. According to ATF, the Model 37 fires more than one shot by a single function of the trigger, but it does not do so automatically because the shooter must manually operate the pump action with his non-trigger hand. That logic mandates the same result here. Maintaining the proper amount of forward pressure on the front grip of a bump stock-equipped rifle is no less additional input than is operating the pump action on the Model 37. ATF responds that a shooter is less physically involved with operating a bump stock-equipped rifle than operating the Model 37's pump action. Once the shooter pulls the rifle's trigger a single time, the bump stock harnesses the firearm's recoil energy in a continuous back-and-forth cycle that allows the shooter to attain continuous firing. But, even if one aspect of a weapon's operation could be seen as automatic, that would not mean the weapon shoots automatically more than one shot by a single function of the trigger. After all, many weapons have some automatic features. For example, semi-automatic rifles eject the spent cartridge from the firearms chamber and load a new one in its place without any input from the shooter. A semi-automatic rifle is therefore automatic in the general sense that it performs some operations that would otherwise need to be completed by hand. But, as all agree, a semi-automatic rifle cannot fire more than one shot automatically by a single function of the trigger because the shooter must do more than simply engage the trigger one time. The same is true of a semi-automatic rifle equipped with a bump stock. Thus, even if a semi-automatic rifle could fire more than one shot by a single function of the trigger, it would not do so automatically. Abandoning the text, ATF and the dissent attempt to shore up their position by relying on the presumption against ineffectiveness. That presumption weighs against interpretations of a statute that would render the law in a great measure nugatory, and enable offenders to elude its provisions in the most easy manner. It is a modest corollary to the common-sense proposition that Congress presumably does not enact useless laws. In ATF's view, Congress restricted machine guns because they eliminate the manual movements that a shooter would otherwise need to make in order to fire continuously at a high rate of fire, as bump stocks do. So, ATF reasons, concluding that bump stocks are lawful simply because the trigger moves back and forth, would exalt artifice above reality and enable evasion of the federal machine gun ban. The dissent endorses a similar view. The presumption against ineffectiveness cannot do the work that ATF and the dissent ask of it. A law is not useless merely because it draws a line more narrowly than one of its conceivable statutory purposes might suggest. Interpreting the statute to exclude semi-automatic rifles equipped with bump stocks comes nowhere close to making it useless. Under our reading, the statute still regulates all traditional machine guns. The fact that it does not capture other weapons capable of a high rate of fire plainly does not render the law useless. Moreover, it is difficult to understand how ATF can plausibly argue otherwise, given that its consistent position for almost a decade in numerous separate decisions was that the statute does not capture semi-automatic rifles equipped with bump stocks. Curiously, the dissent relegates ATF's about-face to a footnote, instead pointing to its classification of other devices. The dissent's additional argument for applying the presumption against ineffectiveness fails on its own terms. To argue that our interpretation makes the statute far less effective, the dissent highlights that a shooter with a bump stock-equipped rifle can achieve a rate of fire that rivals traditional machine guns. But the dissent elsewhere acknowledges that a shooter can do the same with an unmodified semi-automatic rifle using the manual bump firing technique. The dissent thus fails to prove that our reading makes the statute far less effective, much less ineffective, as is required to invoke the presumption. In any event, Congress could have linked the definition of machine gun to a weapon's rate of fire, as the dissent would prefer. But, it instead enacted a statute that turns on whether a weapon can fire more than one shot automatically, by a single function of the trigger. And it is never our job to rewrite statutory text under the banner of speculation about what Congress might have done. For the foregoing reasons, we affirm the judgment of the Court of Appeals. It is so ordered. Justice Alito, concurring. I join the opinion of the Court because there is simply no other way to read the statutory language. There can be little doubt that the Congress that enacted 26 U.S.C. Section 5845B would not have seen any material difference between a machine gun and a semi-automatic rifle equipped with a bump stock. But the statutory text is clear, and we must follow it. The horrible shooting spree in Las Vegas in 2017 did not change the statutory text or its meaning. That event demonstrated that a semi-automatic rifle with a bump stock can have the same lethal effect as a machine gun, and it thus strengthened the case for amending Section 5845B. But an event that highlights the need to amend a law does not itself change the law's meaning. There is a simple remedy for the disparate treatment of bump stocks and machine guns. Congress can amend the law, and perhaps would have done so already if ATF had stuck with its earlier interpretation. Now that the situation is clear, Congress can act. Justice Sotomayor, with whom Justice Kagan and Justice Jackson join, dissenting. On October 1, 2017, a shooter opened fire from a hotel room overlooking an outdoor concert in Las Vegas, Nevada, in what would become the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history. Within a matter of minutes, using several hundred rounds of ammunition, the shooter killed 58 people and wounded over 500. He did so by affixing bump stocks to commonly available, semi-automatic rifles. These simple devices harness a rifle's recoil energy to slide the rifle back and forth and repeatedly bump the shooter's stationary trigger finger, creating rapid fire. All the shooter had to do was pull the trigger and press the gun forward. The bump stock did the rest. Congress has sharply restricted civilian ownership of machine guns since 1934. Federal law defines a machine gun as a weapon that can shoot automatically more than one shot, without manual reloading, by a single function of the trigger. Shortly after the Las Vegas massacre, the Trump administration, with widespread bipartisan support, banned bump stocks as machine guns under the statute. Today, the court puts bump stocks back in civilian hands. To do so, it casts aside Congress's definition of machine gun and seizes upon one that is inconsistent with the ordinary meaning of the statutory text and unsupported by context or purpose. When I see a bird that walks like a duck, swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, I call that bird a duck. A bump stock-equipped semi-automatic rifle fires automatically more than one shot, without manual reloading, by a single function of the trigger. Because I, like Congress, call that a machine gun, I respectfully dissent. Machine guns were originally developed in the 19th century as weapons of war. Smaller and lighter submachine guns were not commercially available until the 1920s. Although these weapons were originally marketed to law enforcement, they inevitably made it into the hands of gangsters. Gangsters like Al Capone used machine guns to rob banks, ambush the police, and murder rivals. Newspaper headlines across the country flashed "Gangsters use machine guns," "Machine gun used in bank holdup," and "Machine gun thugs kill postal employee." Congress responded in 1934 by sharply restricting civilian ownership of machine guns. The Senate report explaining the 1934 Act emphasized that the gangster as a law violator must be deprived of his most dangerous weapon, the machine gun. While there is justification for permitting the citizen to keep a pistol or revolver for his own protection, there is no reason why anyone except a law officer should have a machine gun. These early machine guns allowed a shooter to fire in a variety of ways. Some would fire continuously with a single pull of the trigger or push of a button. Others, such as the famous Thompson submachine gun caliber .45, or Tommy gun, would fire continuously only so long as the shooter maintained backward pressure on the trigger. A shooter could still fire single shots by pulling and releasing the trigger each time. The internal mechanisms of automatic fire weapons also varied enormously, with many relying principally on the recoil energy produced by each bullet's discharge to effectuate automatic fire. To account for these differences, Congress adopted a definition of machine gun that captured any weapon which shoots, or is designed to shoot, automatically, more than one shot, without manual reloading, by a single function of the trigger. That essential definition still governs today. The archetypal modern machine gun is the military's standard-issue M16 assault rifle. With an M16 in automatic mode, the shooter pulls the trigger once to achieve a fire rate of 700 to 950 rounds per minute. An internal mechanism automates the M16's continuous fire, so that all the shooter has to do is keep backward pressure on the trigger. If the shooter stops putting pressure on the trigger, the gun stops firing. Semi-automatic weapons are not machine guns under the statute. Take, for instance, an AR-15-style semi-automatic assault rifle. To rapidly fire an AR-15, a shooter must rapidly pull the trigger himself. It is semi-automatic because, although the rifle automatically loads a new cartridge into the chamber after it is fired, it fires only one shot each time the shooter pulls the trigger. To fire an M16 or AR-15 rifle, a person typically holds the grip next to the trigger with his firing hand. He stabilizes the weapon with his other hand on its barrel or front grip. He then raises the weapon so that the butt, or stock of the gun rests against his shoulder, lines up the sights to look down the gun, and squeezes the trigger. A regular person with an AR-15 can achieve a fire rate of around 60 rounds per minute, with one pull of the trigger per second. A professional sport shooter can use the AR-15 to fire at a rate of up to 180 rounds per minute, pulling the trigger 3 times per second. A shooter can also manually bump an R-15 to increase the rate of fire by using a belt loop or rubber band to hold his trigger finger in place and harness the recoil from the first shot to fire the rifle continuously. To use a belt loop, he must hold the rifle low against his hip, put his finger in the trigger guard, and then loop his finger through a belt loop on his pants to lock the finger in place. With his other hand, he then pushes the rifle forward until his stationary finger engages the trigger to fire the first shot. The recoil from that shot pushes the rifle violently backward. If the shooter keeps pressing the rifle forward against the finger in his belt loop, the repeated backward jump of the recoil combined with his forward pressure allows the rifle to fire continuously. A shooter using this method, however, cannot shoot very precisely. He has neither the advantage of the sights to line up his shot, nor his shoulder to stabilize the recoil. A shooter can also use a rubber band or zip tie to tie a finger close to the trigger. If the shooter is strong and skilled enough physically to control the distance and direction of the rifle's significant recoil, the rifle will fire continuously. A bump stock automates and stabilizes the bump firing process. It replaces a rifle's standard stock, which is the part held against the shoulder. A bump stock, unlike a standard stock, allows the rifle's upper assembly to slide back and forth in the stock. It also typically includes a finger rest on which the shooter can place his finger while shooting, and a receiver module that guides and regulates the weapon's recoil. To fire a semi-automatic rifle equipped with a bump stock, the shooter either pulls the trigger or slides the gun forward in the bump stock, which presses the trigger into his trigger finger. As long as the shooter keeps his trigger finger on the finger rest and maintains constant forward pressure on the rifle's barrel or front grip, the weapon will fire continuously. A rifle equipped with a bump stock can fire at a rate between 400 and 800 rounds per minute. A machine gun does not fire itself. The important question under the statute is how a person can fire it. A weapon is a machine gun when a shooter can 1. By a single function of the trigger, 2. Shoot automatically more than one shot, without manually reloading. The plain language of that definition refers most obviously to a rifle like an M16, where a single pull of the trigger provides continuous fire as long as the shooter maintains backward pressure on the trigger. The definition of machine gun also includes any part designed and intended for use in converting a weapon into a machine gun. That language naturally covers devices like bump stocks, which convert semi-automatic rifles so that a single pull of the trigger provides continuous fire as long as the shooter maintains forward pressure on the gun. This is not a hard case. All of the textual evidence points to the same interpretation. A bump stock equipped semi-automatic rifle is a machine gun because 1. With a single pull of the trigger, a shooter can 2. Fire continuous shots without any human input beyond maintaining forward pressure. The majority looks to the internal mechanism that initiates fire, rather than the human act of the shooter's initial pull, to hold that a single function of the trigger means a reset of the trigger mechanism. Its interpretation requires diagrams and animations to decipher the meaning of the statutory text. Then, shifting focus from the internal mechanism of the gun to the perspective of the shooter, the majority holds that continuous forward pressure is too much human input for bump stock-enabled continuous fire to be automatic. The majority's reading flies in the face of standard tools of statutory interpretation. By casting aside the statute's ordinary meaning both at the time of its enactment and today, the majority eviscerates Congress's regulation of machine guns and enables gun users and manufacturers to circumvent federal law. Start with the phrase single function of the trigger. All the tools of statutory interpretation, including dictionary definitions, evidence of contemporaneous usage, and prior interpretations, point to that phrase meaning the initiation of the firing sequence by an act of the shooter, whether via a pull, push, or switch of the firing mechanism. The majority nevertheless interprets function of the trigger as the mode of action by which the trigger activates the firing mechanism. Because in a bump stock equipped semi-automatic rifle, the trigger's internal mechanism must reset each time a weapon fires, the majority reads each reset as a new function. That reading fixates on a firearm's internal mechanics while ignoring the human act on the trigger referenced by the statute. Consider the relevant dictionary definitions. In 1934, when Congress passed the National Firearms Act, function meant the mode of action by which something fulfills its purpose. A trigger meant the movable catch or lever that sets some force or mechanism in action. The majority agrees with those definitions. It errs, however, by maintaining a myopic focus on a trigger's mechanics rather than on how a shooter uses a trigger to initiate fire. Nothing about those definitions suggests that function of the trigger means the mechanism by which the trigger resets mechanically to fire a second shot. The most important function of a trigger is what it enables a shooter to do, what force or mechanism it sets in action. A single function of the trigger more naturally means a single initiation of the firing sequence. Regardless of what is happening in the internal mechanics of a firearm, If a shooter must activate the trigger only a single time to initiate a firing sequence that will shoot automatically more than one shot, that firearm is a machine gun. Evidence of contemporaneous usage overwhelmingly supports that interpretation. The term function of the trigger was proposed by the President of the National Rifle Association during a hearing on the National Firearms Act before the House. He understood the distinguishing feature of a machine gun to be that by a single pull of the trigger the gun continues to fire. He emphasized that a firearm which is capable of firing more than one shot by a single pull of the trigger, a single function of the trigger, is properly regarded as a machine gun. Distinguishing a machine gun from a pistol, he emphasized that for a pistol you must release the trigger and pull it again for the second shot to be fired. He did not say the hammer slips off the disconnector just as the square point of the trigger rises into the notch on the hammer, thereby resetting the trigger mechanism to the original position. He instead emphasized the action of the shooter, who must repeatedly activate the trigger for each shot. Predictably, the House and Senate reports reflect the same understanding of the phrase. The majority cannot disregard these statements as evidence of legislative purpose. They are, along with contemporaneous dictionary definitions, some of the best evidence of contemporaneous understanding. Indeed, at oral argument, when asked what evidence there was that as of 1934, the ordinary understanding of the phrase function of the trigger referred to the mechanics of the gun rather than the shooter's motion, respondent's lawyer could not point to a single piece of evidence that supports the majority's reading. He even agreed that Congress used the word function to ensure that the statute covered a wide variety of trigger mechanisms, including both push and pull triggers. In short, the majority disregards the unrefuted evidence of the text's ordinary and contemporaneous meaning, substituting instead its own understanding of the internal mechanics of an AR-15 without looking at the actions of the shooter. This court has also previously read the definition of machine gun in this exact statute to refer to the action of the shooter rather than the firing mechanism. The court noted that a weapon that fires repeatedly with a single pull of the trigger is a machine gun, as opposed to a weapon that fires only one shot with each pull of the trigger, which is, at most, a semi-automatic firearm. A pull of the trigger necessarily requires human input. When a shooter initiates the firing sequence on a bump stock-equipped semi-automatic rifle, he does so with a single function of the trigger under that term's ordinary meaning. Just as the shooter of an M16 need only pull the trigger and maintain backward pressure, a shooter of a bump stock-equipped AR-15 need only pull the trigger and maintain forward pressure. Both shooters pull the trigger only once to fire multiple shots. The only difference is that for an M16, the shooter's backward pressure makes the rifle fire continuously because of an internal mechanism. In a bump stock-equipped AR-15, the mechanism for continuous fire is external. The shooter's forward pressure moves the lever back and forth against his stationary trigger finger. Both rifles require only one initial action from the shooter combined with continuous pressure to activate continuous fire. The majority resists this ordinary understanding of the term function of the trigger with two technical arguments. First, it attempts to contrast the action required to fire an M16 from that required to fire a bump stock-equipped AR-15. The majority argues that holding the trigger down on a fully automatic rifle is not manual input in addition to a trigger's function. It is what causes the trigger to function in the first place, whereas pushing on the front grip of a bump stock-equipped semi-automatic rifle will not cause the weapon to fire unless the shooter also engages the trigger with his other hand. The shooter of a bump stock-equipped AR-15, however, need not pull the trigger to fire. Instead, he need only place a finger on the finger rest and push forward on the front grip or barrel with his other hand. Instead of pulling the trigger, the forward motion pushes the bump stock into his finger. Second, the majority tries to limit single function of the trigger to a single mechanism for activating continuous fire. A shooter can fire a bump stock-equipped semi-automatic rifle in two ways. First, he can choose to fire single shots via distinct pulls of the trigger without exerting any additional pressure. Second, he can fire continuously by maintaining constant forward pressure on the barrel or front grip. The majority holds that the forward pressure cannot constitute a single function of the trigger because a shooter can also fire single shots by pulling the trigger. That logic, however, would also exclude a Tommy gun and an M16, both of which can fire either automatically or semi-automatically. A shooter using a Tommy gun in automatic mode could choose to fire single shots with distinct pulls of the trigger or continuous shots by maintaining constant backward pressure on the trigger. An M16 user can toggle the weapon from semi-automatic mode to automatic mode. There is no common sense difference between a firearm where a shooter must hold down a trigger or flip a switch to initiate rapid fire, and one where a shooter must push on the front grip or barrel to do the same. The majority's logic does not overcome the overwhelming textual and contextual evidence that single function of the trigger means a single action by the shooter to initiate a firing sequence, including pulling a trigger and pushing forward on a bump stock-equipped semi-automatic rifle. Next, Consider what makes a machine gun automatic. A bump stock equipped semi-automatic rifle is a machine gun because with a single function of the trigger it shoots, automatically more than one shot, without manual reloading. Put simply, the bump stock automates the process of firing more than one shot. Before automatic weapons, a person who wanted to fire multiple shots from a firearm had to do two things after pulling the trigger the first time. 1. Reload the gun, and 2. Pull the trigger again. A semi-automatic weapon like an AR-15 already automates the first process. The bump stock automates the second. In a fully automatic rifle like an M16, that automation is internal. After a shooter pulls the trigger, if he maintains continuous backward pressure on the trigger, the lever itself will not move. Instead, an internal mechanism allows continuous fire. On a bump stock equipped semi-automatic rifle, the automation is external. After a shooter pulls the trigger, if he maintains continuous forward pressure on the gun, the bump stock harnesses the recoil to move the lever back and forth against his finger. That external automated motion creates continuous fire. When a shooter bump fires a semi-automatic weapon without a bump stock, he must control several things using his own strength and skill. 1. The backward recoil of each shot, including both the direction in which the rifle moves and how far it moves when recoiling. 2. The trigger finger, by maintaining a stationary position with a loose enough hold on the trigger that the rapidly moving gun will hit his finger each time. And 3. The forward motion of the rifle after it recoils backward. A bump stock automates those processes. The replacement stock controls the direction and distance of the recoil, and the finger rest eliminates the need to maintain a stationary finger position. All a shooter must do is rest his finger and press forward on the front grip or barrel for the rifle to fire continuously. The majority nevertheless concludes that a bump stock equipped semi-automatic rifle requires too much human input to fire automatically because it requires the proper amount of forward pressure on the front grip to maintain continuous fire. Automatic, however, does not mean zero human input. An M16 requires the shooter to exert the proper amount of backward pressure on the trigger to maintain continuous fire. So, too, a machine gun that requires a user to hold down a button. Makers of automatic weapons may require continuous human input for safety purposes. An accidental trigger pull that activates rapid fire is less harmful if it does not require affirmative human action to stop. Requiring continuous pressure for continuous fire, however, does not prevent a firearm from shooting automatically more than one shot. This court has repeatedly avoided interpretations of a statute that would facilitate its ready evasion or enable offenders to elude its provisions in the most easy manner. The majority arrogates Congress's policymaking role to itself by allowing bump stock users to circumvent Congress's ban on weapons that shoot rapidly via a single action of the shooter. The presumption against ineffectiveness ensures that a text's manifest purpose is furthered, not hindered. Before machine guns, a shooter could fire a gun only as fast as his finger could pull the trigger. Congress sought to restrict the civilian use of machine guns because they eliminated the need for a person rapidly to pull the trigger himself to fire continuously. A bump stock serves that function. Even a skilled sport shooter can fire an AR-15 at a rate of only 180 rounds per minute by rapidly pulling the trigger. Anyone shooting a bump stock equipped AR-15 can fire at a rate between 400 and 800 rounds per minute with a single pull of the trigger. Moreover, bump stocks are not the only devices that transform semi-automatic rifles into weapons capable of rapid fire with a single function of the trigger. Recognizing the creativity of gun owners and manufacturers, Congress wrote a statute loaded with anti-circumvention devices. The definition of machine gun captures any weapon which shoots, is designed to shoot, or can be readily restored to shoot, automatically more than one shot, without manual reloading, by a single function of the trigger. Not more than 4, 5, or 6 shots, not single pull or single push of the trigger. Following that definition, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives has reasonably classified many transformative devices other than bump stocks as machine guns. For instance, the Bureau has long classified forced reset triggers as machine guns. A forced reset trigger includes a device that forces the trigger back downward after the shooter's initial pull, repeatedly pushing the curved lever against the shooter's stationary trigger finger. To a shooter, a semi-automatic rifle equipped with a forced reset trigger feels much like an M16. He must pull the trigger only once and then maintain pressure to achieve continuous fire. Gun owners themselves also have built motorized devices that will repeatedly pull a semi-automatic firearm's curved lever to enable continuous fire. The Bureau has classified such devices as machine guns since 1982. In 2003, the Fifth Circuit held that such a contraption qualified as a machine gun under the statute. An owner of a semi-automatic rifle had placed a fishing reel inside the weapon's trigger guard. When he pulled a switch behind the original trigger, the switch supplied power to a motor connected to the fishing reel. The motor caused the reel to rotate, and that rotation manipulated the curved lever, causing it to fire in rapid succession. The Bureau in 2017 also classified as a machine gun a wearable glove that a shooter could activate to initiate a mechanized piston moving back and forth, repeatedly pulling and releasing a semi-automatic rifle's curved lever. The majority tosses aside the presumption against ineffectiveness, claiming that its interpretation only draws a line more narrowly than one of Congress's conceivable statutory purposes might suggest because the statute still regulates all traditional machine guns like M16s. Congress's ban on M16s, however, is far less effective if a shooter can instead purchase a bump stock or construct a device that enables his AR-15 to fire at the same rate. Even bump stock manufacturers recognize that they are exploiting a loophole, with one bragging on its website bumpfire stocks are the closest you can get to full auto and still be legal. The majority creates a definition of the statute that bans only traditional machine guns, even though its definition renders Congress's clear intent readily evadable. Every member of the majority has previously emphasized that the best way to respect congressional intent is to adhere to the ordinary understanding of the terms Congress uses. Today, the majority forgets that principle and substitutes its own view of what constitutes a machine gun for Congress's. Congress's definition of machine gun encompasses bump stocks just as naturally as M16s. Just like a person can shoot automatically more than one shot with an M16 through a single function of the trigger if he maintains continuous backward pressure on the trigger, he can do the same with a bump stock-equipped semi-automatic rifle if he maintains forward pressure on the gun. Today's decision to reject that ordinary understanding will have deadly consequences. The majority's artificially narrow definition hamstrings the government's efforts to keep machine guns from gunmen like the Las Vegas shooter. I respectfully dissent. Thanks for listening. This podcast is not affiliated with the United States Supreme Court or its staff in any way. The summary of this opinion given in the introduction was taken from the summary provided at oyez.org. Any mistakes in the opinion you just heard should be attributed to this podcast. If you would like to support my efforts to make Supreme Court opinions available to the public, please subscribe. Thank you.